you see a small apartment of just 8 square meters containing 9 bodies. But if you trace the timeline backward, you will find that the beginning of this case comes from something that looked completely harmless at first. In Japanese true crime cases, what often makes a case shocking is not the method of the crime itself, but how ordinary the beginning appears. So ordinary that you don't even realize when danger actually starts. The Shiraishi case is exactly one of those cases. If you only look at the final outcome, you see a small apartment of just 8 square meters containing 9 bodies. But if you trace the timeline backward, you will find that the beginning of this case comes from something that looked completely harmless at first. A space on the internet, an anonymous account, a simple name, someone who wants to die. The first known victim in this case was a young woman named Eiko Tamura. She lived in Kanagawa, Japan, and was in her 20s. From the outside, her life did not show any obvious abnormalities. But if you look deeper into her background, you begin to see a gradual accumulation of emotional instability. Her family had gone through major changes early in her life. Her parents divorced, which fractured her upbringing environment. Later, the death of her mother became a major psychological turning point. For a young person, this kind of repeated family trauma does not always result in immediate breakdown. Instead, it slowly accumulates into internal imbalance over time. On the surface, she was still living a normal life. But psychologically, emotional fluctuations had already begun to appear. As time passed, her condition did not fully recover. She began receiving support from counseling institutions. She entered what could be described as a monitored living environment. Her condition was regularly checked. People tried to help her reintegrate into society, but the problem was that external intervention could not fully resolve her internal emotional instability. During this period, she began spending more and more time online, especially at night. Her phone became her main connection to the outside world, and it was during this stage that she encountered a critical element, an anonymous social media account. Its name was extremely simple: someone who wants to die. At first glance, the name itself does not seem aggressive. In some contexts, it even looks like an emotional support type of account. But the real issue is that this account did not directly post extreme content. Instead, it used what can be described as empathetic language. For example, "I understand how you feel right now. You're not alone. If you want, we can talk." These sentences, on the surface, look like comfort, but for individuals in a vulnerable psychological state, this kind of language can gradually form a dependency structure, from being understood to slowly becoming emotionally connected. Eiko Tamura was gradually drawn into this process. At first, she only read the messages. Later, she began to reply, and then she started actively sharing her emotions. Without realizing it, this communication began to subtly change her behavioral direction. From simple emotional expression to real-world intention. In the chat logs, she repeatedly mentioned that she wanted to leave her current life situation, and every time she expressed this, the account on the other side would respond calmly, gently, and consistently. No rejection, no interruption, only continued validation and emotional companionship. As time passed, the interaction escalated, from text messages to voice conversations, from occasional daytime contact to deep late-night communication, and at a certain point, the account made a key suggestion. "Do you want to meet in person?" This moment became the first real turning point in the entire case, because it meant the relationship was no longer limited to the digital space. It was beginning to move into the real world. The 21st of October 2017 became a critical date. On that day, Eiko Tamura told staff at her counseling facility that she was going out. The reason was simple. She said she was going to buy something. At the time, this did not raise any concern, because in everyday life, this is a completely normal statement. But the problem was that she never. As time passed, her family began trying to contact her. Her phone was unreachable. Her social media activity stopped. Her online presence disappeared. At first, her family assumed she was simply delayed. But as hours turned into days, concern turned into anxiety. Eventually, her brother began to investigate. The first thing he did, and this action became a crucial turning point in the case. Inside the chat logs, he discovered something disturbing. In the month before her disappearance, Eiko had repeatedly expressed emotional distress. But more importantly, she repeatedly mentioned a key phrase, "I want to leave, but I'm afraid of being alone." This sentence later became a critical psychological indicator in the investigation. Because it revealed something essential, she was not simply expressing sadness, she was seeking a form of accompanied escape. And within those messages, the account "someone who wants to die" was always present. It never disappeared, it never stopped responding. It simply remained there, steadily maintaining contact. And at that moment, another critical detail emerged. The two of them had arranged to meet in person. The day Eiko Tamura disappeared was the 21st of October, 2017. From a timeline perspective, there was nothing unusual about that day. She was living in a psychological support facility. Just like she had been before, this facility existed to help her rebuild a normal daily routine. Her life was structured and monitored. There were people responsible for emotional support. Others handled her daily care. Even her family maintained regular contact with her. Everything on the surface looked stable. That day she did something extremely ordinary. She told the staff that she was going so ordinary that it was barely even recorded as significant. And because of that, it later became one of the most dangerous details in the entire case. Because this was the last confirmed moment she was seen making a voluntary decision to leave the facility. According to later investigation, after she left the facility, she showed no abnormal behavior, no signs of distress, no attempts to reach out for help, no unusual communication. Her movement trail became increasingly unclear after a certain point, until it completely disappeared. At first, her family did not immediately realize the seriousness of the situation. In real life, it is common for someone to be temporarily unreachable. Her phone might have been dead, she might have changed plans, or she might simply have been out longer than expected. But as time passed, this normal assumption began to collapse. Because she did not return that day. She did not return the next day either, and there was no response in any form of communication afterward. By the time her brother noticed something was wrong, a critical window had already passed. He tried contacting her social media accounts, but there was no response. At that point, the family finally realized this was no longer a simple case of being out of contact. He began a deeper investigation. And the first thing he did was access his sister's social media account. In later analysis, this step would be considered extremely important because it opened a hidden layer inside the chat logs. He discovered something disturbing. In the period leading up to her disappearance, Eiko's interactions with the account "someone who wants to die" had increased significantly. But the content of these conversations was not just emotional expression. It gradually evolved into something pattern of psychological guidance. For example, when she expressed emotional distress, the account did not discourage her. Instead, it consistently used empathetic language. "I understand you. You're not alone. If you want, we can go through this together." These statements on the surface seem harmless, even supportive, but in a vulnerable psychological state, they can create something else entirely: dependency. Over time, their conversations shifted from emotional expression to behavioral discussion. Aiko began expressing thoughts about escaping her current life. For example, "I wish I could leave everything behind. I don't want to face this alone. Would it be better if someone was with me?" In psychological terms, these statements move beyond emotional release. They begin to resemble behavioral intention formation throughout these conversations. The account Samanu, who wants to die, maintained a consistent response pattern. It never rejected her feelings. It never tried to stop her. It simply continued listening, and sometimes it subtly extended the direction of the conversation, allowing it to continue forward. In investigative analysis, this type of interaction is considered highly dangerous because it does not directly push behavior. Instead, it gradually lowers psychological resistance, narrowing a person's sense of choice over time. More importantly, investigators later discovered that the two had begun discussing meeting in person. This marked a major turning point, because it meant the relationship was no longer confined to the digital world. It was now moving toward physical reality. On the 21st of October 2017, Aiko left the facility and entered the outside world. But the problem was this: after that moment, she never came back. That night, her phone became unreachable. Her social media stopped updating. Her location gradually disappeared. At first, her family waited. But as time passed, waiting turned into concern, then into anxiety, and finally into certainty she was missing. The case officially entered a missing persons investigation, but at this point, the investigation was still limited. There was no crime scene, no witness report, no direct evidence of wrongdoing. It was only after her brother began deeper investigation that the first critical clue appeared. By reviewing the chat logs, he discovered something important. In the period leading up to her disappearance, Aiko repeatedly expressed a contradictory emotional state. She wrote, "I want to leave, but I'm afraid of being alone." This sentence would later become a key psychological indicator in the investigation because it revealed something essential. She was not simply trying to escape her life, she was seeking a form of accompanied escape. And within that emotional state, the presence of the account Samanu, who wants to die, became a highly sensitive variable because it matched her deepest emotional need to be understood and not to be alone. At the end of the investigation into this phase, one more critical detail emerged. The two of them had arranged to meet in person, and that meeting would become the turning point where this case shifted from online interaction into real-world crime. Initially, Aiko Tamir's disappearance was not treated as a serious criminal case. The reasons were simple. She was an adult. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene. There were no direct witnesses, and there was no confirmed evidence of a crime scene. Because of this, the case initially remained at the level of a missing persons investigation. However, as time passed, one key issue became impossible to ignore. Her final known movements did not match a typical disappearance pattern. She did not simply vanish without warning. There was a clearly defined, last known action. She left the facility to buy something, and then completely disappeared. After the family submitted additional information, the case was gradually escalated. Police officially began a deeper investigation, and the first step was to re-examine her communication records. With the help of digital forensic tools, investigators successfully recovered the full chat history between Aiko Tamura and the anonymous account known as Samonan Who Wants to Die. At that moment, the nature of the case began to change. Because these messages were no longer just emotional conversations, they began to show a structured pattern of influence. Investigators noticed a very important characteristic. The account never directly expressed dangerous or violent intent. Instead, it consistently used empathetic language. However, throughout the conversation, it repeatedly reinforced a central direction: escape from reality plus emotional resonance, plus the possibility of meeting in person. More importantly, these interactions were not isolated or random. They were continuous, gradual, and layered over time. In psychological terms, this is known as a Fey-gradual dependency, building pattern Fey. In other words, it does not directly push behavior, It reduces psychological resistance over time. As the investigation deepened, police discovered a critical turning point. There was, in fact, a confirmed agreement between the two to meet in person. And this agreement was not made suddenly. It was built gradually through ongoing conversations. At this point, police began attempting to trace the anonymous account in reverse. But a major problem quickly emerged. The account had no real identity information. No verified personal registration. No traceable device history. It functioned as a completely anonymous presence. Faced with this, investigators decided to take a more active approach, a sting operation. They attempted to re-establish contact using reconstructed online communication patterns. By simulating the behavior of the victim's family, they tried to re-enter the conversation environment. At the same time, they analyzed all previous chat logs in detail, searching for behavioral patterns that could reveal the suspect's next move. During this process, a new lead emerged. Another individual came forward and contacted the victim's family. Her name was Yasuko. Yasuko's testimony opened a new breakthrough in the case. She claimed that she had also previously interacted with the same someone who wants to die account, and her experience closely matched Aiko's Sami emotional vulnerability stage, Sami online contact pattern, Sami gradual movement toward meeting in person. This discovery led investigators to a serious conclusion. This may not be an isolated incident. It could be a repeated behavioral pattern. As a result, the case was officially upgraded to a high-priority investigation. Police began integrating two major lines of inquiry. First, Eiko Tamura's disappearance case. Second, the digital interaction patterns provided by Yasuko. With support from cybercrime units, investigators began behavioral analysis of the someone who wants to die account. They discovered that its activity followed a consistent pattern. It was most active during nighttime hours, especially during emotionally sensitive periods. More importantly, the account appeared to selectively target specific individuals, those experiencing emotional distress, those expressing loneliness, or those showing psychological vulnerability. This significantly shifted the direction of the investigation, because it suggested this was not random communication, it was targeted behavioral engagement. As the investigation continued, police moved forward with a sting operation strategy. They designed a simulated conversation approach. Their goal was to trigger the suspect to reappear online. Meanwhile, they analyzed one critical question. Had this person already met victims in real life? Through surveillance systems, investigators finally captured a crucial image. A male figure appeared alongside Eiko Tamura at a train station. Although the footage was unclear, the timing perfectly matched her disappearance window. This was the first real-world evidence of physical contact. Even though identity could not yet be confirmed, the direction of the case had become clear. Police began narrowing down the suspect's possible locations, and gradually focused on a specific residential area. Eventually, all investigative threads converged on a single point, a seemingly ordinary apartment, known that would soon reveal a far darker reality. The location police eventually identified was a completely ordinary apartment. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. A standard residential building, a standard rental unit. Even visually, it looked identical to the surrounding apartments. But the real problem was simple. All investigative leads pointed here. Police decided to conduct an immediate raid. When they knocked on the door, the person who opened it was Shiraishi. According to later records, he did not show any visible panic when facing the officers. Instead, his emotional state appeared unusually stable, almost disturbingly calm. The first question police asked was direct. "Where is Eiko Tamura?" At that moment, something in the atmosphere changed, but he did not immediately deny anything. He did not try to evade the question. He simply paused for a moment, then turned around and pointed deeper into the apartment, and he said a single sentence, "She is there." That moment became the turning point of the entire case. Police immediately entered the apartment. Their first impression was not blood, but order. An unnatural level of order. The room. Police opened the first container. inside, they found large amounts of cat litter, but further examination confirmed the presence of human remains. This discovery immediately escalated the case. As investigators continued searching, more containers were uncovered, and as the inspection progressed, the situation rapidly escalated beyond control, because what they found was not a single victim, but multiple victims, multiple sets of human remains stored separately. As the search continued, an even more disturbing fact was confirmed. Inside this 8-square-meter room, there were remains belonging to approximately 9 victims. What made the discovery even more disturbing was not just the number, but the method. The bodies were not randomly placed. They were systematically processed. The interior of the room revealed a highly deliberate organizational structure. Asterisk cat litter used to conceal odor. Asterisk containers used for classification. Asterisk visible areas kept clean and orderly. Asterisk hidden areas carefully sealed and stored. This pattern immediately led investigators to a conclusion. This was not a one-time incident. It was a repeated, ongoing process. Even more disturbing, investigators discovered another detail. One of the containers was empty, but it was not discarded. It had been deliberately kept. During later interrogation, the suspect allegedly made a chilling statement: that one was for the next person. This statement shifted the entire case into a psychological dimension, because it was no longer just a record of actions. It suggested a form of future planning. At the same time, additional evidence was found inside the apartment: mobile devices, chat logs, and traces of multiple online accounts, all of which further confirmed a critical pattern. The victims were overwhelmingly sourced through online contact. It functioned more like a closed, long-running system, a behavioral structure repeatedly operating within a physical space. And at the center of that system, there was always one entry point: the anonymous account known as "somebody who wants to die." As evidence continued to emerge, the nature of the case shifted completely from a missing persons investigation to a serial, large-scale criminal case. As investigators began reconstructing the sequence of events, a highly abnormal structure emerged. These cases were not random. Instead, they showed an extremely dense time-based pattern. According to the final investigation results, all incidents were concentrated within a span of just 2 months. The timeline was as follows: 1 case in August, 4 cases in September, 4 cases in October. A total of 9 victims. This level of density is extremely rare in criminal investigations, because it suggests this was not a long-term hidden operation. Instead, it was a rapidly repeated behavioral cycle over a short period of time. More importantly, there was almost no direct social connection between the victims. They came from different backgrounds, different environments, different life circumstances, but they all shared one critical similarity: they had expressed emotional distress or psychological vulnerability online. This discovery began to clarify the structure of the case. Investigators gradually realized that the victims were not randomly selected. They were being filtered through a specific mechanism. As the investigation deepened, one question kept coming up: how was the suspect finding these individuals? The answer increasingly pointed to one central channel: the online social space. The account known as "someone who wants to die" appeared consistently across all cases. It was not just a communication tool, it functioned as a continuous connection point. Police then conducted a deeper analysis of the chat logs. They discovered that the account followed a very consistent behavioral pattern. It did not directly threaten or express violent intent. Instead, it maintained what can be described as emotional resonance-based interaction. For example, when a victim expressed pain, the account did not discourage it. When they expressed loneliness, it did not reject them. Instead, it reinforced a single consistent feeling: you are understood. In psychological terms, this type of interaction has a specific effect. It does not create conflict. It reduces psychological defense mechanisms. As time progressed, the interaction evolved from simple text conversations to deeper emotional attachment. and then from emotional attachment to the possibility of real-world contact. Investigators discovered that in multiple cases, the victims eventually followed the same behavioral step. They agreed to meet in person. And this was the critical turning point in the entire case. Because once the interaction moved offline, all digital safety boundaries completely disappeared. Further analysis revealed something even more disturbing. In every case, the disappearance occurred shortly after interaction with this account. This created a highly consistent temporal pattern. As the case became clearer, a deeper question emerged. Was this account simply an individual operator? Or was it part of a sustained behavioral system? Meanwhile, investigators began reconstructing the suspect's operational logic. They identified a highly consistent sequence. Step 1. Establish online contact. Step 2. Build emotional trust through empathy. Step 3. Guide the victim toward meeting in person. Step 4. Transition into a controlled physical environment. The dangerous aspect of this structure is that it does not rely on physical force. It relies entirely on psychological influence. Even more importantly, this process repeated almost identically across every victim. There were no major deviations, no improvisation, no variation. This indicates that this was not random criminal behavior. It was a highly stable operational pattern. In later stages of the investigation, analysts even reconstructed a timeline model. They overlaid each victim's behavioral path. The result was alarming. The trajectories were nearly identical. This revealed one of the most disturbing truths of the case, a strong systemic repetition pattern. And at the center of this system, there was always one constant variable, Shiraishi Takahiro. As this chapter came to an end, investigators began confronting a deeper concern. The danger in this case was not only what had already happened, but what could still happen, because if a system successfully operated 9 times, then logically, could there still be a 10th? After police completed the full-on site investigation, the complete evidence chain was gradually reconstructed. It included chat logs from online communications, surveillance footage, physical evidence recovered at the scene, and extensive human remains found inside the apartment. Together, these elements formed a fully connected evidentiary structure. And the center of that structure pointed to only one person, Shiraishi Takahiro. As the case moved into the judicial system, formal charges were filed. The case then entered the trial phase. At the beginning of the proceedings, the defense attempted to present several arguments. The core claim was this: some of the victims had previously expressed, within online conversations, an intention to end their own lives voluntarily, because one critical fact could not be ignored. All victim behavioral trajectories showed clear and consistent patterns of external guidance. They were not isolated individuals making independent decisions. At the same time, the chat logs submitted by investigators became key evidence in court. These records clearly showed that the defendant used the same communication pattern across multiple cases, including continuous empathy-based messaging, systematic reduction of psychological defenses, reinforcement of loneliness, and gradual encouragement toward offline meetings. In court, this behavioral pattern was defined as a systematic inducement structure, and this classification became a central pillar of the conviction. As the trial progressed, the defendant himself made a significant statement in court. He did not deny the actions. Instead, he chose to fully admit responsibility. He acknowledged that all actions were carried out by himself, and he stated that none of them were performed under external pressure. Even more strikingly, during his testimony, he showed almost no emotional fluctuation. His tone remained calm, almost detached. In court records, this state was described as emotionally detached testimony. As evidence continued to unfold, the full structure of the case became increasingly clear. 9 victims, a span of 2 months. A highly repetitive operational pattern. and a clearly defined online manipulation pathway. The court delivered its final verdict. Shiraishi Takahiro was sentenced to death. This ruling sparked widespread debate in Japan. Some viewed it as a necessary and justified outcome for extreme criminal behavior. Others began to focus on the broader issue of online safety and digital vulnerability, because what made this case so unique was this. It was not a traditional violent crime. It was a behavioral chain formed entirely through digital communication. Its origin was not physical confrontation. It began with online conversations, and its progression relied entirely on emotional structure and psychological escalation. In the execution phase, the sentence was carried out, and the case was officially closed in a legal sense. However, from a societal perspective, the issue did not end there. Because the case left behind a deeper question, in an era where the internet connects people constantly, and where loneliness and emotional vulnerability coexist online, where exactly is the boundary? If one person can influence another's actions through conversation alone, can that still be considered voluntary? And if such a pattern can be repeated, does that mean similar risks still exist today? These questions were never fully answered in court. The case is ended, but the discussion has not. The true significance of this case lies not only in its outcome, but in the new type of risk it revealed, a form of crime that does not rely on physical violence, but instead operates through emotional connection and psychological influence over time. When the internet becomes the primary way humans connect, danger can emerge in the quietest possible way.